Okay. So at this stage, I'm going to start the defense of God. And I want to preface it by, there's an old Irish proverb that says, Rawa idir char daul, which literally means a choice between two blind goats. So it's the story of a farmer who's lazy, and it's market day, which happens once a month in his local town, and he wants to go to buy a goat, but he's too lazy to get up early. So when he arrives in the market, there's only two goats left, and they're both blind. So in Irish, we say it's a choice between two blind goats. Rawa idir char daul. Now, that's the situation in which many people, spiritual people, found themselves. There was a choice between a psychopathic divinity and a meaningless atheism. And so they're stuck in this place in between. You know, who do you opt for? You know, a psychopathic God that you worship because you're afraid, you know, or you go atheistic because that God doesn't make any sense to you. And I mentioned an example of that this morning in the Stockholm syndrome. So I put God on trial this morning then, and I brought in a Bible scholar who led us through the journals, looking at the psychopathy, you know, and the murderous slaughter committed by this alleged God. And then I brought in a clinical psychologist to kind of do a diagnosis of what his problems might be. And then I brought a contract lawyer to look at how God continually broke all of his own covenants. So, you know, if that was the only evidence you had, it would be, you'd immediately say, this God is guilty on all counts, he's guilty, and end of story. But then I realized, you know, as we all do, that there are always two sides to every trial. So I wanted to look at, I don't want to make the same mistake that was made, say, for instance, with Jesus, who underwent 4 mock trials in the last 24 hours of his life. He's dragged before the high priest first, and he's accused of being a blasphemer. And then he's sent on to Pilate, and Pilate regards him just an annoyance. And Pilate sends him on to Herod, and Herod regards him as just a buffoon. And then Herod sends him back to Pilate. And at this stage, Pilate has, okay, enough already, let's get rid of this, crucify him. So I want to make sure that, you know, we give God a fair trial. So that's what I'm going to do in this lecture here and in the next lecture this evening. I'm going to bring in a defense of God. And I'm going to bring in 4 different experts, a different Bible scholar. I'm going to bring in an archaeologist, so I'll deal with those in this lecture. And then in the final lecture today, I'll bring in a mythologist and a Jungian analyst to speak up in God's defense. And I'm going to be dealing with a lot of dates. And pardon me, they're very important for you to understand the evolution of the Bible. You need to have a sense of the chronology of its evolution. And I'm going to be using, scholars prefer a different kind of nomenclature. We used to talk about BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, after Christ. Scholars prefer to use BCE and CE. BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means in the Common Era. So as I divide up the dates, when you hear me say BCE, that would have been like before Christ in the old system. And when you hear me say CE, it would have been like AD in the old system. So firstly, then I bring in the second Bible scholar. And the most important thing we need to learn at this stage initially is that great German biblical scholars in the 1800s particularly, when they analyzed the language of the Hebrew scriptures, you know, and the kind of the semiotics, there's a language to grammar as well. You know, grammar is the construction of individual sentences, and there's a subject, predicate, object. There's a study called semiotics where there's actually a grammar to a paragraph or a grammar to a page of text. And it's a very interesting system. So they're using semiotics, they're using paleography, they're using the content, they're using the kind of language that's being used. And they identify that there are 4 totally different streams of literature that have been brought together in the Hebrew scriptures. And they have very, very different agendas. They've got very, very different vocabulary. They've got a very, very, very different kind of a sense of, you know, of their times. And so they're all lumped together. They've all been really badly edited and lumped together in what we call the Bible. And so these amazing scholars, they sorted out 4 different traditions, and they call them J, E, D, and P. J stands for the text in which God is spoken of as Yahweh. Now, the thing is, there were German scholars, and so J and Y are interchangeable in German. You know, so they called God Jehovah or Yahweh. Now, in actual fact, there is no J in the Hebrew calendar, in Hebrew, alphabet. The letter J does not exist in the Hebrew alphabet. The letter Y is what exists. So the German scholars were mixing up Y and J. So when you talk of Jesus, for instance, with a J, that's not his name. It's Yeshua with a Y. Or you talk about Jerusalem with a J, it's not spelled with a J, it is Yerushalayim with a Y. When you think about Jacob, it's not spelled with a J, it's Yaakov. And so we have to realize that that's what's happening, but they call that system J. And it's the stream of literature in which God is referred to as Yahweh. The second stream is E, and it is for Elohim. And there's a whole other bunch of stories in which God is spoken of as Elohim. And Elohim in Hebrew is actually, it's a plural term. And it does not mean gods, it means the powerful ones. It's very, very definitely kind of polytheistic. So there's a whole stream of literature in which God is referred to, as Elohim. Then there's a third stream, which is called D for Deuteronomy, meaning the second law. And it's a compendium of legislation, which was put together, and I'll tell you when it happened. And it's called D for Deuteronomy. And then there's a final one, which is called P for the priestly source. There's a whole bunch of documents in the Hebrew scriptures which have been written by priests having to do with ritual and law, stuff like that. So unless you tease out these four streams, a lot of the time, it's not going to make any sense to you. So these brilliant guys did this research in the 1800s. So when you hear me mentioning J, E, D, and P, I'll explain it a little bit more, but you don't have to realize they're coming from four totally different mindsets at different times of the evolution of the Bible, and have been all lumped together. So that when we're reading it now, often you get two or more of these traditions, even in the same, paragraph of a book, let alone in different books. So that's important in kind of sorting them out. So having said that now, I need to go through dates and give you a sense of the actual evolution of the composition and the writing of the Hebrew scriptures. So pardon the dates, but it gives you a sense. I don't expect you to remember them all, but it'll give you a sense of the flow and the chronology of how this extraordinary book came into being. So allegedly, the Hebrews left Egypt in the year 1050 BCE, led by Moses. And they spend 40 years wandering in the desert, and they arrive in the promised land in the year 1210 BCE. But it takes them 200 years to actually conquer the land. And so in the year 1010 BCE, King David finally captures Jerusalem, and makes that the headquarters of the new nation. So that was 1010 BCE. David's son Solomon succeeded him. And Solomon built the first temple, which was started about 950 BCE. And at this stage, it's in Jerusalem, in the southern part of the country. And at this stage, they begin recording, stories about their own origin myths and about their own spirituality. And in that system, they're calling God Yahweh, Yud He Vuv He. It's called the Tetragrammaton, 4 letters, Yud He Vuv He, because they don't want to pronounce the sacred name of God. So it's written as a Tetragrammaton, 4 letters. But we would call that J, or some people would call it Jehovah. So they begin writing the J stream around that period of time, about 950 in the southern kingdom. Now, in 933 BCE, there's a civil war in the country, and 10 of the tribes secede. And they're the tribes in the northern part of the country. So 2 tribes are left in the south, centered on Jerusalem, and that's Judah and Benjamin. The 10 northern tribes secede, and now they will be called Israel. So from now on, Israel means only the northern part of the country and the 10 northern tribes, whereas the southern portion will be called Judah, and it will have 2 tribes. Now, Judah, centered on Jerusalem, has a temple and a priesthood and kingship. The northern group, they don't have a king. The king who succeeded, Solomon, was a blow-in. And in fact, over the next 17 kings in the northern kingdom, 9 of them are assassinated by people who succeeded them. So they're not in the lineage of David at all. It's a totally different lineage. And they have no priests left, and they have no temple. So they're dependent for their spirituality on the prophets. So the prophets become very important in the northern kingdom, not so much in the southern kingdom, because spirituality was going to depend on the temple, on the king as the son of God, and on the priesthood. So that happened about 933 BCE. About 750 BCE, then the Northern Kingdom begins recording its own kind of origin myths and its own spirituality. And in that spirituality, they'll call God Elohim. So that will be known as the E stream, E for Elohim. And I point out again, Elohim is a plural, and it literally means the powerful ones. And in many of these passages, there's a dialogue going on in the group. For instance, when God says, let us build man in our own image and likeness, it's an inner dialogue, an inner council of powerful ones talking to each other. So you don't have the notion of a single divinity. So Elohim is a plural word. Also in the Northern Kingdom around this time, they begin a compendium of legislation, which was subsequently known as Deuteronomy or Second Law. Now, in the year 721 BCE, the great Assyrian Empire conquered the Northern Kingdom of Israel. And actually, the Southern Kingdom of Judah went into an alliance with the Assyrians against their brothers in the north. And so the Southern Kingdom is spared and the Northern Kingdom is destroyed. And the Assyrians take the 10 northern tribes, and they're known as the lost tribes of Israel. They're never heard of again. They disappear from history. Now, before they're conquered, a few of their scholars escaped down to the south, and they brought the E parchments with them and a partially completed D parchment with them. And they brought them down to the Southern Kingdom of Judah, and they were stashed in the temple, but they got lost. And so for like 120 years, they were lost. And then there were big renovations done to the temple in Jerusalem in the year 600 BCE, and they rediscovered these documents, the E documents and the D documents. So now the scholars in the south, they completed the D document and they combined it with the E and with the J documents. And now they invent the character called Moses. So we're talking now about 600 BCE. Moses gets invented. There is no mention of Moses before that. He's invented at this stage and retroactively put into some of the stories. Now, unfortunately, the Assyrian Empire is overthrown by the Babylonian Empire about this time, about 600 BCE. And so in 597, the Babylonians attack and capture Jerusalem. And they install a puppet king. And then they go back to Babylon. And the puppet king attempted to create a war against the absentee landlords. And they came back in 587 BCE. They captured the king. While he was watching, they killed all his sons, and then they blinded him and took him to Babylon as a captor. And they destroyed the first temple, which had been built 400 years before by Solomon. So the temple is destroyed in 550 BCE. The last two tribes then are taken into exile in Babylon. And they're absolutely scared that they're going to disappear from history like the 10 northern tribes did. So there's a huge movement among the priests and the prophet Ezekiel particularly, who flourishes at this time, to try to save Jewish spirituality and Jewish religion. And so they now work furiously to combine J and E and D. And at this stage, they invent the P stream of literature. The priests could create a whole bunch of documents and rituals. And now they combine all of these four into one that we know as Torah, particularly. And so it's a compendium of 4 totally different streams that are very, very badly put together and very, very badly edited. So frequently you get 2 or 3 versions of the very same story. So there are completely competing versions of the flood that you're going to find in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 have 2 totally different kind of renditions of creation itself, when and how creation came into being, side by side. Chapter 1 comes from the one tradition, and chapter 2 from the next edition, side by side. So they're very, very badly put together. But it's a compendium of stuff that's going to allow these people to survive. Now, in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great, the emperor of Persia, overthrew the Babylonian Empire, and he offered freedom to the 2 tribes of Judah to go back to the land of Israel. Now, in fact, very few of them chose to go back. Most of them chose to stay on in Babylon. but a bunch of them did go back. About 50,000 actually went back. And Cyrus did this in order to kind of shore up the western flank of his empire, because at this stage, Egypt was resurrecting and becoming a great military power as well. So he wanted allies on his western flank. And so he assisted their journey back, and he assisted giving them funds to rebuild the temple. So by 515 BCE, the second temple is erected. It was nothing like the first temple, according to the reports at the time, but it's rebuilt at least. And then about the year 400 BCE, there's a significant editing, a re-editing and redaction of the scriptural tradition. They're trying to further sort out, these four streams of literature. In the year 330 BCE, the Greeks overthrow the Persians under Alexander the Great. And Alexander conquers what I'm going to call now the land of Israel, and pushes the Persians eastwards, and actually goes and captures Babylon and the Persian Empire, and goes all the way across to the gates of India before he dies at age 33. Now, about the year 300 BCE then is the very first mention of Moses outside of the Bible. He's not known in any literature outside of the Bible until 330 BCE. So when the Greeks come into the land of Israel and they discover some of the documents, that's the first time ever you get mention of Moses in extra biblical material. Eventually, the year 187 BCE is the Maccabean revolt against the Greek occupancy, and the Maccabees are successful and they throw out the Greeks. And for a period of time, there's self-rule in Israel, but it only lasts about 120 years, because there's a civil war happens about the year 80 BCE between two Maccabee brothers, descendants, each of whom wants to be the king. And in this battle, they call in the Romans. One of them guys calls in the Romans to help his case against his brother. And the Romans come in the year 70 BCE, and they stay for the next 500 years. Yeah, and they will eventually destroy the temple. So we've shifted now from BCE to CE, the common era after the birth of Jesus. And in the year 66 CE, the Judeans revolt against Roman occupation. And there's a siege of Jerusalem that lasts for 4 years. And in the year 70, CE, Jerusalem is conquered and the Second Temple is destroyed. And then there's a lingering, lingering kind of war going on against Roman occupation. And the final battle is fought by a great Jewish warrior called Bar Kokhba. And between 132 CE and 135 CE, he's fighting guerrilla warfare against the Romans. And finally, he's destroyed, in the Judean desert. And that's the end of of Judaism. And we don't see, the land, the Jews are scattered. There's always a population of Jews living there, but the vast bulk of the population is exiled and doesn't get back to the land of Israel until 1948 in our times, with the setting of the modern state of Israel. Now, just the first temple that was destroyed in 587 BC, and the second temple, which was destroyed in 70 CE, they both fell on the very same day of the Jewish calendar. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha meaning 9, the 9th of Av. Av is a month in the Jewish calendar. So they both fell on Tisha B'Av. And so that's a great day of mourning within Judaism, that both temples, hundreds of years apart, were destroyed on the very same date in the calendar, called Tisha B'Av. So that's kind of just a sense of then of how these documents came into being and their interrelationships. And so this Bible scholar then will remind us that the Bible is a library of many different kinds of literature. There's part of it is historical, part of it is poetical, part of it is dealing with eschatology, the last days, part of it is theology, part of it is proverbs, part of it is riddles. It's like your Sunday newspaper, I said, different sections. And so the Hebrew scriptures were written by hundreds of different authors over a period literally of over 600 years. And they remembered stories, they invented stories, they inherited stories, and they updated stories, which is what every kind of mythological system does. And in the final lecture today, I'll talk about the mythology of these stories, because mythology is very often misunderstood. So that's the second Bible scholar's rendition of that. This is how you get to understand how this Bible came into being chronologically and historically. I then brought in an archaeologist to talk about in defense of God, and particularly to deal with the character of Moses and the story of the Exodus. Now, the Exodus putatively happened in the reign of Ramesses II, who was probably the most successful Egyptian pharaoh of all time. He was an extraordinary builder. He left an extraordinary amount of literature in his wake. So he's a really, really famous character. And at this stage, during his reign and subsequently, Egypt owned the entire Sinai Peninsula. It ruled the entire Sinai Peninsula, all the way east to modern-day Iraq, or what's called Mesopotamia, the twin rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, and all the way north to present-day Turkey. So it owned that entire area and it ruled that entire area. So to think that, you know, a group of slaves escaped into the Sinai desert and wandered for 40 years is a ridiculous story. It's totally made up. There is no way it could have happened, or that the Egyptian forces wouldn't have run them down. Now, the Egyptians were fastidious record keepers. There's no mention whatsoever about a bunch of escaped slaves leaving Egypt, you know, and it would have been a bunch of about nearly 2 million people. So it's important to realize that. The book of Exodus claims that the Israelites who escaped consisted of 603,550 military men. So if you extrapolate from that and say, okay, presumably there are guys over 16 and under 60. If you include boys under 16 and men over 60, and you include all of the women and girls, you're talking about a population of about 2 million people. And so the idea that 2 million slaves could have escaped from Egypt in the most powerful reign under the most powerful pharaoh ever to exist, and wander in an area which was controlled militarily by the Egyptians for 40 years and get away with it, you know, that's mishugas. Now, so of all those people who allegedly escaped, only 2 of them actually made it to the promised land, according to the Bible itself, Joshua and Caleb, and everybody else died in the desert, including all their cattle and all their livestock. And so where are all the bodies? So in 1967, you know, in our lifetime, there was a group of 4 Arab armies that attacked Israel, the land of Israel. No warning whatsoever. They attacked on 4 fronts. They attacked Israel. They attacked from Syria. They attacked, you know, from Jordan. They attacked from Egypt on 4 different fronts. And in 6 days, the Israeli Air Force particularly wiped them out. It's called the 6-Day War, 1967. So they recaptured the entire Sinai Peninsula, all the way down to the Suez Canal. And hordes of Israeli archaeologists descended on the Sinai Peninsula to try to excavate the remains of this Exodus. And they spent the next 10, 15 years literally going through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for evidence of the death of 2 million people and all of the livestock. They didn't find a single human or animal bone. People said, well, it was like 2,000 years ago. Archaeology now has technology that it found evidence of nomadic peoples who lived there before the putative Exodus, and the kind of the imprint that they left there, they found evidence for that. But they didn't find any evidence whatsoever of an Exodus. And moreover, many of the towns which are mentioned in the book of Exodus as towns that the Israelites captured and destroyed, they didn't exist at the time that allegedly the Exodus took place. And so modern Israeli archaeology has determined that what are called the Israelites were actually Canaanites themselves. They were groups of nomadic Canaanites who attacked settled Canaanite settlements, towns and villages of settled Canaanites. They were the same ethnic group. They were Canaanites. The only archaeological difference they found between what we call the Israelites and the Canaanites was the absence of pig bones in the nomadic sites. And so the Israelites were actually just a group of Canaanites, nomadic Canaanites, who banded together and began attacking settlements and eventually taking them over. And so the evidence from the archaeology and from the kind of the biblical scholarship is that Moses never existed. it was invented at a later period, importantly so, very importantly so. And the Exodus never happened. Now, there's a reason why those stories were invented subsequently, a very important reason. And the reason was that there was a real Exodus that happened, 700 years later, when the remnant of Israel was set free from Babylon to come back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian captivity. At that stage, there was a real exodus of people coming back to the land of Israel. And they needed a hero figure. They needed to believe that they could do it. They needed to believe that they had done it in their past, that there were people who had generated great heroes in the past. And so they invented that, great heroes, like all mythologies do. And when I talk about mythology in the afternoon, I'll illustrate that further. And so there was a real exodus, but it was 700 years after the alleged exodus of Moses. And so Moses, even though he never existed, is possibly the greatest liberator of all time. And I'll mention why I say that later. So the Exodus story may well have been the greatest story ever that never actually happened because of the effect it had, on world history subsequently and on peoples throughout the world. Now, I think there's another Jewish story which is even more transformative than that. And it's the story of Yeshua ben Yosef, the story of Jesus, the son of Joseph, and the transformative event of his lifetime, his death and his resurrection. It has, this story has inspired the Moses story, and the Jesus story has inspired hopeless individuals and conquered peoples. The Jesus story for 2,000 years and the Moses story for 2,500 years. It has been a David and Goliath story, writ large, for nations in order to throw off the shackles of slavery and captivity, and for ordinary people who in depressed situations to throw off addictions of various kinds and enslavements of different kinds. So for a man who never existed and for an event that never happened, he may well have been one of the most important characters in all of human history, and it may have been one of the most important events in all of human history, in spite of the fact that he never lived and it never happened. And so what is the truth of this story? I've said to you many, many times that I have a very different definition of truth. Something can be true, but not factual, like Moses or the Exodus. It's true, but it's not factual. And something can be factual, but it's not true. So my definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God or with love. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with love or with God. So when I read the story in the Hebrew scriptures, the story of Moses and the story of Exodus, I see in this a real true story, which is why we can't get rid of these scriptures. There are many, many other jewels in the scriptures that you'll discover as you work properly with them. But this story is absolutely true because it has this extraordinary transformative effect, not just in the Jewish nation who learned to believe in themselves, during the exile in Babylon and during almost 2,000 years of exile from the land of Israel after the Roman occupation in 70 CE. It allowed this extraordinary people to survive all kinds of pogroms and all kinds of holocausts for the next 2,000 years. It was in a belief in this story and a belief in this hero character and in a belief in this event that sustained them and continues to sustain them. So was it factual? No, it wasn't factual. Did Moses actually exist? No, he didn't actually exist. Did the Exodus actually happen? No, it never actually happened. Was Moses true? Absolutely. Was the Exodus true? Absolutely. So when we know how to understand it, we see that this character of Moses and this event of the Exodus is the central story of Pesach for Judaism and of Easter for Christians. And so they're absolutely true. Semantics has to do with the kind of just the usage of individual words. Semiotics is the grammar of sentences or the grammar of paragraphs. And so, for instance, if you have an existing text and some other person edits the text, they're going to leave their imprint on the edited version. You'll see a different vocabulary, a different choice of words from the original, and you'll see a different kind of system of combining, you know, subject, predicate, object, or adjectives and adverbs or whatever. And so you can't really, a second person can't actually edit a previous text without leaving some kind of footprints in it. And semiotics is the science that can isolate and kind of find out, you know, how the original got changed by a different author. So the Canaanites, when you read through the Bible, the Canaanites were the original inhabitants of the land of Israel, what we now call Israel, what the Romans called Palestine. So this chunk of land on the Mediterranean, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, that land in ancient times was called the land of Canaan, C-A-N-A-A-N. And so the inhabitants were called Canaanites. And the Bible would have us believe that the Israelites were a separate group of people, you know, who came from Iraq originally, across the Fertile Crescent in northern Israel, down through Israel, led by Abraham, and then were imprisoned in Egypt for 430 years, and then came back across the Sinai and began to attack the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, the Canaanites. And so according to the Bible, they're totally different peoples. The Canaanites and the Israelites are totally different people. The Israelites are descended from Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob. But the archaeological evidence shows that the Israelites are actually Canaanites themselves. They just happen to be nomadic Canaanites, as distinct from the Canaanites who lived in settled communities. And these wandering bands of Canaanites then grouped themselves into a force that attacked the settlements, you know, and they are described in the Bible as Israelites, as if they were totally different tribe and ethnic group. They're not. They're a different group of Canaanites. And as I said, the only difference in archaeological sites between Canaanite dwellings and Israelite dwellings is the absence of pig bones in the Israelite. For some reason, the nomadic Israelites decided not to eat pork. Now, it might have to do with some kind of a problem, some kind of a disease that hit the pig population at some stage when they're wandering in the desert. And so they associated the disease with swine flu, just like swine flu. So they take swine off the menu. And so subsequently, you're not going to find any evidence of pork, you know, in those sites. Apart from that, there's no difference between, you know, what you find in Israelite settlements and Canaanite settlements. They're the same people. Obviously, I brought in a defense scholar and a prosecutor. The prosecutor was God was guilty on all counts, as I said this morning. The second Bible scholar's conclusion was that, you know, Moses didn't exist, and these stories are made-up stories. They were made up at a much later stage to kind of, I'll talk about that when I talk about mythology in the final talk, to give, you know, encouragement and strength to a people who were actually in captivity in 550 BCE and were facing a real exodus, to give them the strength to do what they needed to do. So the Bible scholar's conclusion was that these are stories made up to encourage people, to give them hope for the future, but they do not represent a historical past. So God is not guilty of any of these crimes because Moses didn't exist, the Exodus never happened, and this regular slaughter of which we've accused God in the first lecture never actually happened. Yeah, and so probably the best sources are the Israeli archaeologists themselves. And so when I was researching for this book, obviously, I did a lot of research on the archaeology of it, you know, and I think I've actually, in the book, I put footnotes at the back of the book referencing some really top-class Israeli archaeologists and Bible scholars, all of whom came to the very same conclusions as I. And so there are lots of sources. If you can get away from kind of fundamentalist Christian and fundamentalist Orthodox Jewish scholarship, you know, into the real rabbis, you know, and the real scholars of Judaism and archaeology and Bible scholarship and Talmud particularly, which is the Jewish kind of reflection on scripture, then you find exactly what I'm saying, that there are a lot of great scholars, you know, who are saying what I'm saying. It didn't happen. Moses didn't exist, but these are very, very important archetypes for the Jewish psyche and for the human psyche. At the back of the book, I've given a few references. I think that's a brilliant insight, Amy, an absolute brilliant insight, because in some sense, when you think about it, if you take Judaism or Jews as a group of people, they have been forced to be a pilgrim people for, basically 2,500 years. And they've managed to carry their understanding of God with them and never lose faith. I mean, you get secular Jews, true enough, but they're an extraordinary tribe of people that no matter how they've been kind of programmed or holocausted or, deported, from all over Europe. 1492 in Europe, they were kicked out of Spain, they got kicked out of England, they're kicked out of place again and again and again. That they managed to hold this inner kind of a sense of the divine. Now, a lot of peoples who have been colonized have managed to do the same thing. I think, for instance, Native American Indian tradition has done it. When you read of the great journeys that the conquered Native American populations of North America had to kind of undergo, and they still carry their kind of the shamanistic sense of connection to Mother Nature, to Gaia with them. And we're beginning to rediscover the extraordinary wisdom and spirituality of their traditions. The Irish Celts did it. The Irish Celts being forced into exile, through famine and through warfare, and scattered themselves all over the world. And one of the things they brought with them always was their faith. The Tibetan people are the same. When they got conquered by the Chinese in 1959, and the Dalai Lama had to go into exile, you got this extraordinary outpouring of Buddhist mystical theology coming to the West for the first time. So it's almost as if somehow, as a fractal of the fact that we've journeyed from our own divinity with source to exile in incarnation, where we've carried that divine within us. We've kind of, as a fractal, we've reproduced that as a pilgrim people by moving around the planet, or being forced to move around the planet, by being colonized, or persecuted, forcing us to hold on to something special. When I think, for instance, of the slave trade, particularly from West Africa to the Americas, into Brazil, and into Cuba and in North America, and these extraordinary people, they carry their culture with them, they carry their language with them, they carry their spirituality with them, they carry their ritual with them, they carry their music with them. And even though they had to express it in foreign languages finally, and we demonize them as voodoo or whatever, voodoo, they're just sticking nails and stuff. Well, remind you of anybody? Do you ever look at a crucifix? We're sticking nails and stuff as well. We call it the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And so we demonize these peoples who carried the divinity within them into exile in various ways. So I think that's a brilliant, brilliant insight. When you look at any peoples who've been forced into exile and have retained their sense of spirituality and inner divinity, it's like the tabernacle that allegedly had to move through the desert during Exodus for 40 years. They had to fashion a tabernacle and carry it on their shoulders before they settled and built a temple. So it was a mobile Bethel meaning the home, the house of God, but it was a mobile tabernacle. And in some senses, every culture is a mobile tabernacle of divinity. And within a culture, every individual is a mobile tabernacle of divinity. And so in my language, and I know you're very familiar with the Gaelic tradition, we swapped emails constantly, that the Gaelic mythology is full of the very same notion of the veil that we carry within us, that there are sacred places that we call thin places, but there are thin times, like Bealtaine or Samhain, times of the year when the veil is diaphanous. And there are kind of people who are literally mobile tabernacles of mysticism, people like Jesus, people like Mother Teresa, people like the Dalai Lama, people like Nelson Mandela, people like Martin Luther King Jr., whom I would regard as literally mobile tabernacles of the divine. And the fact that they're forced to be pilgrims and uprooted, it gives extra strength. It's like it further strengthens their connection and their identification with source, and not just merely with a geographical location. That's a brilliant insight, Amy. Thank you. Yeah, you nailed it, Joanna. So you got a huge backlash from the fundamentalist communities in the Judeo-Christian system against this. And they come up with all kinds of ridiculous counter arguments. Like I saw an article a few months ago that a claim that they found a chariot wheel in the Red Sea, And it was evidence that Moses had actually parted the Red Sea and that Pharaoh's army had gone in after him. And now they found a chariot wheel, and that's proof that, the Exodus happened and they crossed the Red Sea. So that kind of stuff, or a claim that I saw very, very recently from an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, that there was actually evidence for the Israelites being in Egypt, and that, but the thing is that the Egyptians were so embarrassed by the fact that 2 million slaves escaped, and defeated the Egyptian army, that they wiped out the record, they censored the record, they didn't record it. And that the reason that you don't find it in the copious Egyptian writings from the time is that they were so embarrassed at the defeat that they decided not to make a record of it. So you get this kind of really facetious attempts to kind of explain away what the evidence is glaringly, obviously saying. Yeah. So it's the fundamentalist groups within Judaism and within Christianity that are holding desperately onto the literal interpretation of the story and missing the fact that there's a much deeper truth. The spiritual, mystical truth of this is huge, and they're missing that, and they're holding on to a literalism. You're absolutely 100% right, Didi, because religion never tires of demonizing, God. In fact, by the 12th century in Europe, even Jesus himself had been demonized. And so it's in the 12th century in Europe, you get the great cathedrals being erected to Mary, Mother Mary, and the great hymnals being created, because even Jesus had been turned into a judge who was going to come back at the end times to separate the sheep from the goats. And the fact that, Jesus didn't die for our sins, in the sense that the Father decided, I need a totally innocent victim, and I'm not going to be satisfied until I get my pound of flesh. In this instance, 150 pounds of flesh, and 8 pints of blood or whatever. That's, I'll satisfy. It was not Jesus' mission to come down and be crucified. Absolutely not. Jesus came down to be a liberating and a healer. But it was almost inevitable that, given who he was and the times in which he lived, that he was going to run foul of the authorities, the fundamentalist religious authorities and the Roman occupiers, and that the standard way of dealing with, problems was to crucify people. He did not come down and say, here I am, crucify me. And so I've said to you many, many times that for me, the symbol of the cross, for instance, is not a symbol of torture. The cross for me represents the fact that the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between heaven and earth, between the immanence and the transcendence of God. And the horizontal arm symbolizes the connection between all living beings. And so where they intersect is the individual person. Your individual person, DD, is the intersection of where the divine meets the human, and where you are the cross-section of all the relationships between all the beings with whom you share the planet, or even of the cosmos. So for me, the cross is not an instrument of torture, even if it was employed like that. It's a symbol of the connection between these pieces. But we have this terrible need, to spill blood. We have totally misunderstood the notion of sacrifice.
Yes.
The word sacrifice comes from the Latin sacrificere, and sacrificere means to make holy. It does not mean to kill. It does not mean to give something up. It doesn't mean to forego a pleasure. It doesn't mean any of those things. It's come to mean those because of what we've done with it, but it does not involve any of these things. Sacrifice means sacrificere, to make holy. And we make holy by infusing love into the situation. So in 12th century Europe, you had even Jesus being turned into this monster, this judge who was going to come back in the end times, and punish us. And so we take refuge in Mother Mary. So we invent the rosary in the 12th century. We build the great cathedrals of Europe in the 12th century. We create the great hymns to Mary in the 12th century. And there's one great Irish hymn from that period of time. And there's one verse of it that says this. It says, Ismahan vanim veravor, mahir ordri, nasloshir, band acher manadium, band lagashter, faraganri. And in translation it says, she is a great woman, Mary, over there in heaven. She is the woman who has protected me from my enemies. She is the woman who has protected me from the anger of the king. And the king is Jesus. Mary, is the one who protects us from the anger of Jesus, because at that stage, even Jesus had been turned into an ogre. So you're absolutely right. Religion inevitably descends into orthodoxy, which descends into tyranny of various kinds and dogma of various kinds, and then sacrifice becomes bloodletting. As I said this morning in answer to one of your questions, does God have emotions? Yes, but they're all coming out of love. So anything that's coming out of love is going to be love sourced, and love radiated. So there's no, anger in God. There's no anxiety in God. There's no confusion in God. There's no rage in God. There's no destructive power whatsoever. The only thing love can produce is more love. And so destruction of the planet or Lemuria or Atlantis has zilch to do with God. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had nothing got to do with God. The destruction of World War I or World War II has nothing got to do with God. This is not God's will. God's will is that incarnated beings discover their own inner divinity and the divinity of all of the life forms with which they share the cosmos, and operating from that place. And when we take, wrong roads and we follow the service to self, and self-aggrandizement and control over resources, and we oppress people, at that stage, then we create our own demise. Gaia will never give up. Gaia will continue to produce life forms until finally one species gets it right, and we break through into the next dimension. So God doesn't give up and Gaia doesn't give up. And no matter how many times, species destroy themselves, other species will replace them, and they will provide spacesuits for souls coming in order to try to elevate literally the consciousness of the planet itself. So it has nothing got to do with God. So I remember being asked one time a question, can God forgive everything? And I said, no, God doesn't forgive anything. Because in order to forgive, you first have to hold a grudge and then subsequently let go of it. And since God is incapable of holding grudges, God never needs to forgive. So God can't forgive because God never, ever radiates anything except love at our children. Yeah. So there's nothing we can do as individuals or even as nations. There's nothing we can do that will alienate us from the love of God. It's like the sun. The sun is always there. We can put up an umbrella, and shield its effects, but we can't stop the sun from being. You can't stop love. That's brilliant. That's a great question, Patty. So we have to differentiate between pain and suffering. They're very, very different. So pain is the price of incarnation. So yes, it is impossible to experience life without pain, but suffering is very different. Suffering is the interpretation of the pain. Suffering is the stories we make up about the discomfort in which we find ourselves. And so as a psychologist, I can tell you that I would say 85% of the distress I experience in a counseling session has to do with suffering, not with pain. Now, the pain is the fact that we're living inside in these spacesuits, that age, that got sick. We live on a planet which is subject to volcanoes, climate change, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, mosquitoes, stuff like that. So when you take on a physical body, you are going to encounter pain. That's inevitable, yes. The suffering, however, is self-inflicted. The suffering is always the interpretations we foist on the pain that we're experiencing and the stories we make up about it. So for years, I was threatening, I had an office down in Los Altos where I saw clients, and I was threatening to put a notice on my door that said, change the bloody story. Because, you get people coming again and again, session after session after session, complaining nonstop about the same stuff, but not being prepared to do anything different, but indulging the stories, and feeding the stories. And I would say to them, if you have a garden and there's weeds in one part of the garden and you set flowers on the other side of the garden and you keep watering the weeds, stop complaining that the flowers are dying. Whatever you water is going to flourish, and whatever you ignore is going to die. So if you keep watering the weeds are going to thrive. If you keep ignoring the flowers are going to die. And so suffering is where we keep watering the weeds. Now, we're never going to avoid pain. That's the price of incarnation. The question then becomes, how can I utilize the pain I'm experiencing? How can I harvest it, to grow spiritually or to grow in compassion? And so I created a model one time, and I don't want to go too far afield now, but I created a model at one time what I called the my model of illness, and it's a 6-part model. And I created a formula: AX1 plus BX2 plus CX3 plus DX4 plus EX5 plus FX6 equals illness. X1 stands for genetic predisposition. X2 stands for environmental influences. X3 stands for personal lifestyle. X4 stands for personal belief systems. X5 stands for karma, and X6 stands for the bodhisattva vow. And I've used this many, many times with my clients. And so every illness you experience and every pain you're experiencing is a composite of those 6 factors. And I would say to people, I want you to go home and I want you to assign a value to each of these factors. How much of the illness do you think is of genetic predisposition? Do you go with your intuition? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? How much is due to environmental factors? And by environment, I mean both the in utero experience of the developing fetus and the environment in which you grew up and live right now. How much is due to the environment in which you live? How much is due to your lifestyle? Are you sitting on the couch eating Taylor crisps and watching TV all day? Are you out exercising? How much of the illness is due to personal belief systems? You're pessimist by style, nothing is ever good, you like to complain or whatever. X5 has to do with karma. We come down here to learn particular lessons, and sometimes we learn best through illness. And the final part is the bodhisattva vow. The bodhisattva is somebody who's worked off all their own personal karma. They don't need to come back anymore, but they come back to wake up the rest of us. And they're the great avatars. But there's a little bit of the bodhisattva in every single one of us. To the extent that we can be empathetic or compassionate, there's the bodhisattva. For sometimes a person will accept an illness in order to offer other people the opportunity of exercising compassion, or to allow medical science the ability to figure out the etiology of this particular illness. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff. I don't want to go too far afield at this stage. So illness then has many, many kind of different kinds of etiology, but we have to distinguish initially between pain per se and suffering, which is the interpretation and the stories we make up. I think I actually may have done something on this, Paddy, in the book, either on setting psychology, setting spirituality free, or setting science free. It's in one of those 2 sections. I actually did I talked about this issue that I've just mentioned right now. Good, you're absolutely right. And so I have a belief system, another heresy for Ingrid, whatever she is, that if Jesus had lived to be 83 and was dandling his granddaughter on his knee like Joe is doing, or like Amy is doing with her children, he would be no less effective as an avatar, no less effective. And so it wasn't Jesus' death per se that saved us. It wasn't his suffering per se. It was his radical commitment to the mission. And no matter at what age he died, he would have been equally effective because he would have been pouring love into the container of incarnation. Just as the Buddha did it for 80 years. The Buddha was 80 years old before he died. And so, it wasn't the shelf life of Jesus that determined, his importance, or the manner of his exit that was important. It was the quality of his commitment to being a loving presence. Absolutely. And I actually said that in the book, in the trial itself, that when you look at the evidence, when somebody calculated one time that God was personally responsible for 2,181,353 deaths personally, as well as kind of floods and mandating other genocides and whatever. The devil in the Bible is only responsible for 10 deaths. Yeah. And you find it in the story, the book of Job. And the devil did it because he had an agreement with God that he was going to test Job. And the devil killed Job's children by making the house in which they were celebrating a brother's birthday collapse on top of them and killed the 10 kids. So the devil is responsible for 10 deaths in the Bible, and God is responsible for literally millions of deaths. So absolutely right. The caricature of God is the one who makes people do what they do. And that's why I said at the beginning that part of the devastation of this belief in this, pathological God is that it's justified the ways in which we behave as human beings as well. And the justification, that I didn't do it, it was the devil made me do it. So you're absolutely right, Karen. It's psychosis, yeah. And psychosis can hit an individual or an entire culture or a nation or sometimes even a species. And then they're capable of all kinds of darkness. And somehow is that there's there's an inner level of service to self that believes that the inner movements are divinely inspired. And so somebody crawls onto a bus in Israel, a suicide bomber with a belt of grenades around his waist, and it's a school bus and blows up and kills 70 kids and is a martyr. And the entire culture applauds, this action. And so the notion that you can even win kudos for being a killer of people, it's not just that God told me to do it, but God is going to reward me for doing it as well. Yeah. 72 virgins waiting at the other side because I killed 70 kids on a school bus.